There's a specific moment, late at night, when you put your phone down on the nightstand, and for just a second, your face changes. Nobody sees it. There's no audience, no notifications waiting to be answered, no one scrolling past your story. And yet, something in your expression shifts, like a muscle finally allowed to rest. It makes you wonder what your face actually looks like the rest of the time. Because somewhere between waking up and that quiet moment before sleep, you were on. Maybe not performing in some dramatic, theatrical sense. Just adjusted, calibrated, a slightly better version of tired, a slightly more composed version of stressed, a slightly more fine version of whatever you actually were. And the strange part is, you probably didn't choose to do that. It just happened, the way breathing happens. I think most people would say they're not performers. Performing sounds like something actors do, or influencers, or people with ring lights and microphones clipped to their shirts. Performing sounds intentional, calculated, and most of us would never describe our actual lives that way. But then, think about the last time someone asked how you were doing, and you said good, just busy, when busy wasn't really the word. Busy was the acceptable word, the word that doesn't require anyone to ask a follow-up question. That's not lying, exactly. It's something quieter than lying. It's translation. You're translating an internal state into something that fits the social moment. And we do this so often, so automatically, that it stops feeling like a choice at all. Maybe that's the first thing worth sitting with. Not that people are fake. Almost nobody is walking around being deliberately fake. It's more that everyone has learned, slowly, invisibly, which version of themselves is allowed in which room. There's the version of you at work, slightly more confident than you feel, slightly more on top of things. There's the version of you with old friends, the one that can slip back into jokes from 10 years ago like no time passed, even if right now, today, you don't actually feel like that person anymore. There's the version on a video call, sitting up a little straighter, the bookshelf behind you arranged just so, even if the room behind that bookshelf is a mess you didn't have time to deal with. None of these versions are lies. They're just edits. And here's where it gets interesting, because this isn't new. Humans have always adjusted themselves for different situations. Sociologists have been writing about this for decades. This idea that life is something closer to a stage, and we're all playing slightly different roles depending on who's watching. What's changed isn't the performing itself. It's the size of the audience, and how long the performance has to run. Because it used to be that your public self had office hours. You went to work, you performed professionalism, and then you went home, and the performance, mostly, ended. Maybe you saw a few people at dinner, maybe a phone call with someone, but there were real stretches of time where nobody was watching at all. Now, the audience never really logs off, even when no one's actively looking at your life. The architecture is built as if they might be at any moment. Your photos are ready to be seen, your responses are time-stamped, your online status is visible whether you want it to be or not. And so the performance doesn't end anymore. It just lowers in volume. I keep thinking about how exhausting that actually is. When you say it plainly like that, not dramatic exhausting, just a low hum of effort that never fully turns off. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't quite fix, because it's not really about hours of rest. It's about hours of being observed, or being observable, which your nervous system apparently treats as almost the same thing. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from being slightly performative for 12, 14, 16 hours a day, and most people don't even register it as performance. They just feel drained, and they assume the drain comes from the tasks, the meetings, the errands, the messages. But maybe some of it comes from something underneath the tasks. The constant, quiet calibration of how you're coming across while you do them. There's a version of this that shows up most clearly in something almost embarrassingly small. Choosing what to post. You take a photo, maybe of food, maybe of a view, maybe just a moment that felt good for some reason you can't quite explain. And then before it goes anywhere, there's a pause. A tiny, almost invisible negotiation happening in your head. Does this look like I'm trying too hard? Does this look like I'm not trying at all? Will this seem like I'm doing well? Or will it seem like I'm showing off that I'm doing well? It's wild, if you really think about it, how much editing happens before anyone else even sees anything. The performance starts in private. Long before there's an audience, you're already rehearsing for one. And the strange part is, sometimes you don't even post it. The photo just sits there, unshared, and yet the mental work of imagining how it would be received that already happened. The audience was there, in your head, even though they were never actually invited. This is where it stops being about social media specifically, and starts being about something bigger. Because that same internal audience follows you into rooms where there's no phone in sight at all. It's there when you're choosing what to say in a meeting, quietly running a simulation of how each phrase might land. It's there when you're getting dressed in the morning, not exactly for anyone in particular, but for some general, ambient sense of appropriate. It's there when you laugh slightly louder at a joke that wasn't that funny, because the room expected a laugh, and silence would have felt like a statement. None of this is sinister, it's just social. Humans have always read rooms, but the rooms have multiplied, and so has the reading. Here's where the financial side of this quietly slides in, and at first it doesn't look financial at all, because performing isn't free, not in some abstract, poetic way. I mean literally. The version of yourself that you present, especially the version you present in public or online, tends to come with a price tag. The clothes that look effortless, the apartment that looks put together in the background of a call, the vacation that looks like it happened easily, spontaneously, when really it took months of saving and planning that nobody saw. There's a particular kind of spending that doesn't come from wanting things. Exactly. It comes from wanting to not seem like you're missing things, which is a very different motivation, and a much harder one to satisfy, because there's no finish line. You can't outspend a feeling of falling behind, because the feeling isn't really about money. It's about visibility, about how your life reads from the outside. And this is where it gets quietly devastating, if you let it sit for a second, because a lot of people are financially stretching themselves. Not for comfort, not even really for status in the old, obvious sense, but just to maintain a baseline level of seeming fine, seeming like things are under control, seeming like you're not the one struggling, in a world where everyone seems to be doing okay, except, somehow, also nobody is. That gap between how things look and how things feel, that's where a lot of quiet financial stress lives, not in big dramatic purchases, in small, constant ones. The subscriptions you forgot you're paying for, the slightly nicer version of something you didn't need, bought because the cheaper version felt like it said something about you, the dinner out that you couldn't really afford, but turning it down felt like it would say even more. It's strange how much of modern spending isn't really about the thing being bought at all. It's about what not buying it would seem to mean. And underneath all of that, there's a tiredness that's hard to name, because it doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from being too much, constantly, in too many directions at once. The work version, the social version, the online version, the family version, each one slightly different, each one requiring its own kind of energy, and each one running, quietly, in the background, even when you think you've logged off. Maybe that's part of why so many people describe feeling tired in a way that doesn't match their actual schedules. On paper, the day wasn't that demanding, but something about it still left you depleted. Maybe it's not what you did, maybe it's how many versions of yourself you had to be, just to get through it. There's a moment that a lot of people quietly recognize, even if they've never said it out loud. You're at home, alone, no plans, nowhere to be, and instead of relief, there's this strange restlessness. A kind of itch that doesn't have an obvious source. So you open your phone, not really to look for anything specific, just to check, to see what's happening, to see who's doing what. And within a few minutes, something subtle has shifted. The evening that felt peaceful 5 minutes ago now feels a little empty, a little behind. Somebody at a dinner, somebody on a trip, somebody just got something, achieved something, announced something, and your quiet night at home, which was completely fine 30 seconds ago, suddenly needs to justify itself. That's such a strange kind of pressure, when you really look at it. Nobody told you your evening wasn't good enough. You told yourself, by comparing it to a highlight reel of everyone else's curated evenings, most of which probably involved their own quiet, uneventful moments that simply didn't make the cut. Everyone is editing. Everyone is choosing the version that gets shown, and yet, somehow, everyone also forgets this when they're looking at someone else's edit, and only remembers it when they're making their own. It's almost funny, actually, in that uncomfortable way where you laugh because the alternative is feeling a bit sad about it. Everyone's backstage, comparing their backstage to everyone else's highlight reel, and somehow concluding that they're the only one who's behind. This is where the performance starts to feel less like something people are doing to each other, and more like something everyone's doing alone. in parallel, without realizing the person next to them is doing the exact same thing. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Performing isn't really about deception, it's about loneliness. Because if everyone's editing themselves, then nobody's really being seen. Not fully, not the tired version, the uncertain version, the version that doesn't have it figured out. And if nobody's being seen, then nobody's really being known either. You can be surrounded by people, online and in person, constantly in contact, constantly connected, and still feel like nobody actually knows what's going on with you. Not because you're hiding some terrible secret, just because the version of you that's visible has been quietly smoothed over for so long, in so many small ways, that even you might not be totally sure what's underneath it anymore. That's the part that sneaks up on people. Not I'm pretending to be happy, more like, I'm not sure when I stop checking in with how I actually feel, because I've been so busy managing how things look. If these kinds of conversations feel familiar, if you've ever caught yourself mid-performance and wondered what you'd be like without an audience at all, you're probably the kind of person who'll get something out of sticking around for the ones that come after this. There's something almost tender about the moments when the performance slips. Not dramatically, just slightly. Someone says I'm fine and their voice cracks a little on the second word. Someone laughs and it's a half second too late, like their face hadn't quite caught up to the joke. Someone posts something raw, something unfiltered, and you can feel, almost physically, how different it is from everything around it. And the responses to those moments are often disproportionately warm. People lean in, people relate, because for a second, the performance dropped, and what was underneath was just a person, tired, uncertain, real. It makes you wonder what would happen if that happened more often. Not as some grand, dramatic vulnerability, just small, ordinary honesty. Actually, today wasn't great. I don't really know what I'm doing either. I'm exhausted, and I don't think it's just from work. Maybe people would relate more than expected. Maybe the gap between everyone's fine and everyone's actual experience is smaller than it looks, and the only reason it feels so wide is that everyone's performing the same gap, separately, convinced they're the only one. There's a particular kind of quiet that happens sometimes, late at night, when the apps are closed and the lights are off and there's nothing left to check. No more updates, no more feeds, just the room and you. In that quiet, there's no audience, no version of you that needs to seem like anything. And for some people, that quiet feels uncomfortable, almost unfamiliar, like a room they don't visit often enough to feel at home in. Maybe that's worth noticing, not in a self-critical way, just noticing. The way you might notice you've been holding your shoulders too tight all day, without realizing it until someone points it out, or until you finally put them down. Because if performing has become so constant that the absence of it feels strange, that might say something about how much energy has been quietly going somewhere for a long time, without ever being acknowledged. It doesn't mean the performing was wrong. Exactly. A lot of it is just living in a world with other people, adjusting, adapting, reading rooms. That's not a flaw. That's just being human, in a time when the rooms happen to be louder and more numerous than they used to be. But maybe there's a difference between performing sometimes and performing as the default setting. Between having a public version of yourself for certain moments and forgetting that the private version still exists at all. Maybe the goal isn't to stop performing entirely. That's probably not realistic, and honestly, it's not even necessary. Maybe it's something smaller, just remembering every once in a while to check in. To ask quietly, underneath all the versions, how am I actually doing? Not the good, just busy answer. The real one, even if it's messy, even if it doesn't have a clean sentence to describe it yet. Because that gap between the edited version and the actual one doesn't close by trying harder to seem fine. If anything, it closes a little every time someone, anyone, lets it show, even slightly, even just to themselves, in a quiet room, with no one watching. There's something strange and a little comforting about realizing that everyone else is doing this too. Not as an excuse, just as company. The tiredness you feel after a long day of being slightly more composed than you actually were. Other people feel that too. The small financial stretches to keep up appearances. Other people are doing that too, often for the exact same reasons, often about the exact same things. The late night restlessness, the comparison, the feeling of being behind. It's not a personal failing. It's something closer to a shared condition. Quiet, mostly unspoken, and far more common than it looks from the outside. Maybe that's the strange relief in all of this. Not that the performing stops, but that you're not the only one doing it. And maybe, just maybe, noticing the gap, the effort, the quiet exhaustion underneath the composed version of everyone, is enough to make tonight feel a little lighter. Not because anything's been solved, just because something's been seen. Maybe that's enough for tonight.